Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast that pays for its own wallpaper. And how are you, Rob?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, no, I'm not bad. Just, slowly easing out of lockdown, as we all are, which is kind of nice. Yeah. I think we should probably press on with the headlines, though.
Let's go for it.
So our first headline is from the Metro. Race to get aid to India.
Yeah, this is the story that's become apparent that India is becoming the latest sort of like COVID hotspot in the world. And in particular, they're being hit very, very hard by it. And I think this story serves as a reminder that even when you think you're out the other side of it, you can't be complacent and you have to realize that other waves might be coming. Like, for example, this was a country that was hosting England in test matches and having 50% attendances at those test matches about 2 months ago. And now they've just seen their COVID levels rocket. Cases in India just took a massive spike up to over 300,000. Sort of in the matter of a couple of weeks, and deaths in particular, like deaths per day, they've seen that go up to over 3,000 deaths a day, which is on the equivalent of like the USA and Brazil, which have been the former places that have seen the most deaths per day. Of course, if you're looking at it from like a countrywide perspective and the amount of population, like India has 1 billion people, you might expect it to have a higher number of deaths a day just because of the sheer amount of people that live there. But the other big thing that's been coming out of there is that you've had hospitals that have been struggling to keep up with oxygen supply, and there were news of like 12 people dying at one hospital in India simply because they couldn't get the oxygen to them quick enough. They were patients that would have lived if they were able to keep on that.
Yeah, no, I think that's been the saddest thing to see, is that these people who, with what we now know about COVID, these people should be able to get through, but then there's a lack of supply. And I think also the government has been very much downplaying how bad it is. And there are many problems with the leadership currently in India about on this issue, specifically, like they were encouraging people to go outside, encouraging.
There's an election coming up as well, so there was like people mingling for that. But I know that Modi in particular, his popularity is at least going down in those states worse affected by COVID at the moment. Yeah,
and I think there's been I haven't been paying as like super close attention to this. I've kind of seen this in broad strokes, but I believe that there's talk of the government like not publishing the correct figures and things like that, and it's very much been like people on the ground sharing information via social media that's actually managed to get a lot of the information in these stories out. And we don't really have all the time to cover it in our short headlines section, but makes for hard reading, but there's some very good information out there about the problem currently being faced in India.
Yeah, I think it just serves as a big reminder of whatever people say about COVID and, it only kills 1% of people or whatever, blah, blah, blah. I don't have time to go into those arguments, but this is what happens when your health system gets overwhelmed by it, and it has a big knock-on effect. And India was always going to be one of those places where you might have highlighted and said their health system is maybe not equipped as others over the world to deal with this, but the fact that they're overwhelmed and that is exacerbating the problem, and how do you recover from that position? It just serves as a reminder for like us, even in our system. That's why you can't just let people go maskless, free, mingling, not vaccinated, because you will overwhelm your health service, and that will have a knock-on on a variety of different conditions, no matter what, if all your ICUs are filled up with COVID patients. So a stark reminder.
Even without that, 1% of the population of India is more than the population of the UK by a significant margin. It's a lot of people. And I think at the moment, I know we don't have too much time here to talk about this, but one of these things that's brought up is about, sharing vaccines. Like there's been kind of this very much, both in the US and the UK, we'll vaccinate our own first. And COVAX, the vaccine task force that tries to collect vaccines to send out to other countries, is only now getting promises of like vaccines for 2022, and they need them now to deal with these issues. So yeah, I think there needs to be pressure on UK and US governments at least. If not as well the European ones, once they start, like we've already talked about how the fact there's been problems with getting the vaccine out in the EU. We also, we need to also start thinking about how we're getting vaccines out to other countries, because if you have a large population who get infected, you get a new variant that comes back here, and then it could potentially circumvent the vaccine, and we'd all be back in the same mess we were last year. So it's, the world is interconnected, and you can't just ignore this because it's in another country.
Yeah, exactly. And just just the thoughts with India at the moment. I know lots of people are going through a very, very tough time there. So yeah, wishing everybody all the best.
One more related point on this story before we move on. our contributors who helped give us such excellent episodes on the Indonesian elections have shared a few stories with me about how they have a big religious festival coming up called Lebaran. I hope I've pronounced that properly, but it's based on Eid al-Fitr, which is going to draw people out. And currently there's a lot of people in Indonesia saying we need to think about that. We can't just have this, because their cases are currently low. But if you look over at India, they had the same problem, 2-3 weeks back, where they were like, well, maybe slightly more than that now, but they were saying, oh, it's okay to have weddings and other religious festivals. They had the I can't remember the name of the festival on the Ganges, and so
yes, I know the one you mean.
Yeah. So like letting people mingle in those ways is not going to work at the moment, especially if you haven't got vaccination rolling out at a high level. So I think we need to keep an eye on it, and I don't think India is going to be alone in this. It's just that India is the one currently experiencing the worst of it. If you can push your leaders wherever you are to try and help with this, I'm sure there are various petitions and other ways going around to try and share things. I know that Boris has said he will send, I think he said he'll send ventilators, but like, I think, as we said, it's just running out of the basics at the moment. That's the problem. So there needs to be some humanitarian effort. So moving on to our next story, and this dominated the headlines the last for at least a week, from The Independent. Own goal.
Yeah, this was suddenly, all of Twitter was talking about football, because this is to talk about the European Super League, which is the attempt by 13 clubs, 6 of them English, to try and break away from their current own national leagues and form one European Super League, which would have about 15, we'd have those 13 teams, 2 others, and then 5 other teams could maybe get access to it on a rolling basis if they did super well in their national leagues. And people kicked off about it. They were really unhappy that these big super clubs would try and break away. The main reason behind the anger, I think, was just kind of like the greed behind it. If you don't know, like clubs like Manchester United get a lot of money through TV rights, and we're talking like millions upon millions for just like being in the Premier League. But they felt that if they went to this European Super League, they would get double that money, which when you've got like a pandemic going on, crowds not going to be able to go to the stadiums and even protest this properly, it felt wrong as a football fan to be thinking like, why are you doing this now? It also went against one of football's golden rules, or at least within I would say in European football, the idea that you can be promoted and relegated from a league. So there is a theory that Torquay United could perhaps work their way up the football pyramid and win the Premier League. In this European Super League, there would be little to no chance of that ever happening, and operating this closed shop where teams get to be super, in their own words, forever. Teams like Tottenham Hotspur, who are like, we're talking about teams who are like 8th in their own league, teams that are behind Leicester and West Ham in the Premier League, wanting to have this right to play Real Madrid every week just because they've got the most money. People felt there was something intrinsically wrong about that. And because it's football, which is one of the most like popular sports, everybody was getting involved. Even Boris Johnson got involved, saying that he would step in and try and make sure it didn't happen. And in the end, there was quite the swift climb down. I think it lasted all of about 2 days before English teams started to pull out. And once those teams were gone, it's very hard for the other teams to stick in. I think there were 3 teams still involved, Barcelona, Real Madrid and Juventus. But I imagine that they can't really have a 3-person league just playing each other all the time. So it's one of those things that, again, it spoke to me a lot as a football fan. Like, I cared about it a lot. It was something which, when I hear about, I just, for some reason, emotionally felt that it was wrong. And I just wanted all these big 6 teams to lose every game just to prove that they're like, you think you're special? No, like, look at Leeds United I think Leeds United drew 1-1 with Liverpool, which was one of the teams that was involved and said they'd break away. And that seemed like a victory in a way. It was like, yes, you prove that you can't just beat this team that was promoted from the Championship last year. Football seems to be a sport about earning your greatness rather than just putting yourself in a league and just staying there. On a side note, the only place that really doesn't do promotion and relegation tends to be like American sport, where you just have franchises that play on a semi-regular basis, but those that finish at the bottom and nothing ever changes. And a lot of these teams that wanted to enter into the European Super League had American owners. So some people think there might be some of like just American owners not seeing the problem with franchise sport. That's what they do at home, and nobody complains there. But yes, I think the idea is dead for now, but I think it was one that, it's kind of brought up every 5 years, and this is the furthest it's ever got. So I wonder where we'll be again in another 5 years' time if this gets brought up again. But for the moment, the fans seem very much against it.
I mean, I know my insight on this is not going to be as good as yours, as anyone who's listened to the Hat and Many Things episodes on sport can attest to. But yeah, no, I think that was one thing that came out of it, was that it's very much how Americans run sport with a lot of their leagues. And I think the other thing, like as you say, yeah, I mean, the idea that you can be relegated and all of this, you made the good point that, money talks. So, Man United has always been up there for a long time, and another team, Man City, and they move around, but they're still in the kind of the top group. And being relegated from the Premier League is, the people who get relegated from the Premier League tend to go down and then they come back up. That tends to be how it is. There's a few teams, but I mean, then you look at something like AFC Wimbledon, which is fans' response to the fact that Wimbledon got sent off to Milton Keynes. The original team was essentially disbanded, and now that team, they didn't get relegated this year, but they were on the up and up for several years, and then they get the investment, and then they can continue to move up. Is the idea. And I think that idea that it's community sport, and especially, I don't know how it is in other European countries, but a lot of UK-based football teams grew up in that kind of, it was a working man's kind of game, and then it became a game that was tied very closely to location. So everyone supported their local team, and it's less like that now. But I think, people still, that sense of community is still important to people. And taking that away and just like picking an arbitrary team who happened to be in a league just doesn't, like you say, it's just not cricket. Because it's
exactly. There's history tied to those places. All those clubs are hundreds of years old and have a good heritage. You can't just suddenly like make up a team and call them the South London Reds and say, yeah, everybody from South London, now you support this team. It doesn't feel right in the same way, or doesn't have like all the same emotions behind it. So yeah, I think your reasons are like entirely another reason why it would fail, and why it gets this kind of emotional response from people, because it's something that people have great ties to and family ties to and everything. So yeah, destined to fail, I think.
Yeah. So moving on into our main story tonight, we have a few headlines for you. From the Daily Mail: Doms all out war with the PM. From the Metro: Interior resign. And from the Mirror: cash for curtains. What are we talking about here, Rob?
So yeah, this is the other story that has been dominating the papers, and quite rightly so, in my opinion. It's mostly about Boris Johnson, the Conservatives, and this sort of veneer of sleaze that has come over the Conservative Party. Sleaze and the Conservative Party are something that have like had a history together. So the major government, in particular, from 92 to 97. Was something that was riddled with accusations of sleaze, most memorably the Cash for Questions scandal, which was the premise that lobbyists would pay MPs to have a question in PMQs and promote it to the Prime Minister to try and get their cause across in some way. And it was judged like pretty bad form that you could influence somebody in that way to try and get to the Prime Minister. This has come back in a various amount of forms, but just so we can kind of like keep it tight. And when I typed in like, oh, what Conservative scandals have we had recently? We won't be covering the PPE scandal. So that's basically allegations that the Conservatives gave PPE contracts to friends of Conservatives. And that they're mates, rather than bringing it out to their contracts. We won't be looking over the Jennifer Arcuri affair, which is the American businesswoman who admitted she had an affair with Boris Johnson whilst he was in the process of breaking up from his wife at the time. And equally, whilst she was going out with Boris Johnson in secret, she also got over £100,000 of public money towards her own business venture. But I must point out that Boris Johnson said that there was no wrongdoing, and those two things aren't linked. However, it's not a great look for the Prime Minister. We also won't be covering Greenshill and lobbying, which is another thing that's hit the front pages recently. So that's David Cameron, a former PM working for a Greens Hill group that looked to basically get government contracts and take some money sort of out of the NHS into more of a private healthcare zone. The fact that David Cameron could lobby and not go through official channels, but could basically try and hit Boris Johnson up on the down low, or try and have a sneaky conversation with Rishi Sunak. Those type of things has raised into question, hey, is it right for former prime ministers, and is this the right way for the Conservatives to tackle lobbying? That's raised concerns over corruption, but we're not talking about that. And the final one we're not talking about is Robert Jenrick and the housing scandal, which was really a few months back now. But one of the contractors who wanted to build a load of homes, essentially it was revealed that he had it was sending personal messages to Robert Jenrick via text, trying to influence him to release land so his housing development people could buy it and build on it for a fee that was maybe not as much as it should be. Robert Jenrick said even though he received those texts that he never acted on them, and that was the most important thing. But still, again, all these kind of unofficial channels for contacting members of the government, and then how that money is being spent. That's where we've had the main focus on scandal.
I definitely think it says something that there are this many scandals we're choosing to ignore for the purposes of brevity in this episode. So just keep that in mind. The other thing I want to say, it's kind of funny, given the recent information that Boris Johnson's phone number has just been on the internet for 15 years, where anyone could contact it. That people had this kind of special access when actually anyone could have just found his phone number and rung him up and been like, hey, Boris, I really need a PPE contract. But yes, I suppose we should move on to the actual scandals we're going to discuss.
Yes. So the main ones, and the ones that three ones that came out through this chatty rat scandal, I guess we'd call it. People feel that there is a leak in government and somebody has been feeding the press with certain bits of information. The first one that came out was this quote that Boris Johnson apparently said whilst talking about the possibility of having a lockdown last October. What he is meant to have said, what he is alleged to have said, is that he would rather let the bodies pile high in their thousands than have another lockdown again, which is quite the turn of phrase if he used it, and one that has clearly sparked a lot of emotion within people, particularly those who lost friends and loved ones to the terrible disease. Now, it's worth pointing out immediately that Boris Johnson has denied that he said it, and this is very much a case of, he said, she said, I guess, with two opposing sides, both trying to say that, one person said one thing, but there being very little proof that Boris Johnson said it. But the fact that a major newspaper, in this case the Mail, felt that their sources were credible enough to run with this headline says something for the validity of it. It's not just Westminster gossip. And I think this is one that really goes to try and attack the character of Johnson, particularly when he has, within those COVID briefings to the nation, has been a big promoter of lockdown. And making sure that's safe. And clearly the way Boris Johnson has responded to this is saying, no, lockdowns work. I want to promote lockdowns. I don't want to undermine what we've done here. The leaks that came out from these meetings and who was on the side of lockdown and who wasn't. Another thing that came out was said that Rishi Sunak might have been on the side of not locking down. To be fair enough, he is the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and we know the economic effect that, lockdown has on business. So I'm not surprised that he was initially against that idea. But the fact that the Prime Minister might show, with this quote, I would say it shows an extreme disregard for people's lives, is kind of scary, and I think is a scandal that is worth talking about. From somebody this high up in government, you might expect that from an enraged civil servant or a lobbyist or somebody who is particularly worried about the economy in such a way that they think it would be catastrophic. But the Prime Minister, it's certainly a poor choice of phrase, I would say. Even if it was meant to be an off the cuff remark or whatever, it's just not a phrase I would ever say in the context of having a discussion about lockdown. And I think that's why people are talking about it so much.
Yeah, and I think it's one of those he had definitely supporters of Boris Johnson, part of his they think part of his charm, I think, is the way he kind of deals with questions, and he can be a bit rambly and off topic. That's not a rambly thing to say. That's very much saying the wrong thing. I mean, I know he says, I know there's many examples of him saying racist things or whatever, but the people who vote for him don't care about those. Whereas this is the kind of thing where you'd like to think that the average person hearing that will go, that is not okay.
Oh yeah, totally. If it will have an impact on his public perception, I don't know. I guess the real test of that is in a couple of days' time. But I certainly don't think it does much to improve it. I don't think many people will be looking at that and thinking, oh yeah, now I think better of Boris Johnson. In fact, I think it'll be quite the opposite. So moving on, we've got the next scandal I'd like to talk about. Which is James Dyson and leaked text messages that he had with James Dyson, who is the inventor of the Dyson vacuum cleaner. This was during the pandemic, and he was trying to negotiate James Dyson to produce ventilators to get us through, because particularly at the start, there was a big worry that we would be behind on ventilator production. We would need a lot of them if the NHS got overwhelmed. Why not go to James Dyson, one of Britain's foremost inventors, to try and get assurances that he can make these for us? One of the ways that this came about was through text messages that happened between Johnson and Dyson himself. So the text exchange, James Dyson said, "We are ready, but nobody seems to want us to proceed, sadly." Boris Johnson says, "I will fix it tomorrow. We need you. It looks fantastic." Rishi says it's fixed. "We need you here. Thanks. I will give the ventilator our all." And then he says, "I'm afraid that we need a response to our letter below from Rishi, please. We really need Rishi to answer the letter we sent now or make our position clear. It's about work days and exceptional circumstances, umbrella. Work days are not ability to be able to work in the UK in a national emergency, etc." And Boris Johnson says, "I am the First Lord of the Treasury. You can take it that we are backing you to do whatever you need." So this text exchange, although it's a bit wordy and you need to try and break down the text speak, what it essentially seems to be is that Boris Johnson is trying to procure ventilators, but James Dyson kind of wants some kind of quid pro quo from it, just saying, "Oh, by the way, yeah, we'll do it, but we'll need some assurances from the Chancellor that we will get certain tax exemptions or something, because that's what we want to make sure that we can make these ventilators." And the fact that Boris Johnson kind of says, "You don't need even to talk to Rishi about it. I'm the First Lord of the Treasury. I'll be able to deal with it." One speaks to maybe how he can just bypass key members of cabinet. I would argue that the Chancellor of the Exchequer is the most important position under the Prime Minister in terms of cabinet roles, and everything kind of needs to go through them because they're the money. So that's kind of worrying. Two, the fact that no ventilators were ever procured from this agreement either. It seems that James Dyson got what he wanted, but the number of ventilators that actually made their way into service was approximately zero, thanks to this deal that the Prime Minister struck. So there's a bit of question about his judgment there, I guess, and what he's willing to give away on a promise that essentially he gets nothing from. And third, you brought it up earlier, the access people have to the Prime Minister. So you talked about the fact that Boris Johnson's mobile phone number is publicly available on the internet and has been for 15 years. It is meant to be protocol that prime ministers change their phone number and have a very locked down phone when they become there, because guess what? They're the prime minister. Not anybody should be able to contact them. Boris Johnson rejected that and refused to change his phone number and refused to do it. So who knows who might be having those private contacts and those, it feels like a potential security breach in a way, that somebody could just try and influence the Prime Minister on a whim on a contact through WhatsApp, for example. It sounds bizarre.
A dodgy message being "Hey, Bojo, we know where you live."
And I just hey, we can help sort out this problem for X amount of money. Hey, if you give our side, if you start talking about this, then that would be great for this business in the UK. Why don't you do that? We'll make it worth your while. That kind of stuff leads itself it's open to corruption. And I think that's the big problem, isn't it? It's just this is a potential way that a prime minister could be corrupted. And by the way, the prime minister is Boris Johnson. Do you trust him to not be corrupted? Do you trust him in that sense to have that forethought and that judgment not to be swayed in those ways? Personally, I'm not sure. And this scandal does bring up a lot of questions about the prime minister's credibility, his his ability to lead, like his trustworthiness as a prime minister, I feel. And again, in the next scandal we're going to talk about, I feel that feeling, it only gets worse, that you feel that this is a prime minister who is maybe not as transparent about his dealings as he first appears.
Yeah. So these two we've discussed so far, while they did make the headlines, I mean, I feel like they were completely brushed away. Like certain things captured the zeitgeist more than others, and you'd think that horrible quote about bodies piling high would be up there. But I feel like the thing that's very much caught traction and stayed in the news and therefore become the bigger scandal is what we're about to talk about, which is apparently the Prime Minister is supposed to get £30,000, I believe it's a year, for upkeep of the Prime Minister's flat. But he and Carrie Symonds spent a lot more than that, is the claim. And a lot of that went on very expensive wallpaper. So can you tell us a bit more about that, Rob?
Yes. This is the cash for curtains scandal, as it's been called. The redesign of number 11 Downing Street and who paid for it is the big scandal that is kind of rocking Boris Johnson's government at the moment. So, as you said, he gets a grant of about 30 grand, but there has been speculation that he spent about £200,000 to renovate number 11 Downing Street, allegedly because Carrie Symonds wanted to and suggested that the flat they had inherited from Mr. Johnson's predecessor, Theresa May, was a John Lewis furniture nightmare. Which is an odd quote, because I don't know about you, but I would love to have John Lewis furniture. It's quite it's quite like, I would treat it as quite high class. Like, I'm an IKEA man myself. If I had any furniture for John Lewis, I would feel impressed with that side cabinet. I don't know, maybe if I had one side cabinet.
I saw a few people saying, I mean, yeah, I scrimped and saved to get my John Lewis sofa, and it's lasted me how many years, that kind of thing. So I definitely think the average person, sees that as kind of the top end. I was on another server where someone asked me the question, what's above John Lewis? Like, and to which my response was, I suppose Harrods. And you can get into silly money very quickly if you go on the Harrods website. But yes, I don't think anyone, you're talking the realm of millionaires, probably billionaires by the time you're spending money at Harrods as a regular thing.
So if you get in Harrods furniture, that's going to cost a lot of money. It's going to be way over the annual public grant. So who do you get to pay for it? That's the big question that is hounding Boris Johnson at the moment, and that he is unable to answer. The one question that he has been drilled on is who made the initial payment for doing up the flat, and his response has always been, I covered the costs, which is, I would say, vague and non-committal. And this response has basically led to there being an inquiry into who did cover it. And the reason it's important as an inquiry is because, once again, we've said that you don't want outside influences coming in, and you don't want the PM doing things on the promise of somebody, I'll do you a favour by doing up your flat. In return, you give me a knighthood. You don't want that to happen, essentially. And there is rumours and allegations that this has happened in this case. So what has alleged happened, or what they think might have happened, is that the Conservative Party advanced £58,000 to the Cabinet Office to cover the cost of the refurbishment. And that this personal donation, then this loan, as it's being called, maybe came from a Conservative peer, Lord Brownlow, who, according to the Daily Mail, said that he was making a donation of £58,000 to the Conservative Party to cover the payments the party has already made on behalf of the soon-to-be-formed Downing Street Trust. As it happens, no charitable trust called the Downing Street Trust has been formed to date, so we don't quite know where that money's gone, but the timeline seems to suggest that Boris Johnson took a loan from the Conservative Party, and then the Conservative Party took exactly the same amount of money that Boris Johnson loaned as a donation from a peer. He was given a life peer in Theresa May's resignation honours. He had already made substantial donations to the Conservative Party. They say over £714,000 in 2017. But in April this year, it's reported that £58,000 of his donations was personally earmarked for the redevelopment of the flat. So why that loan would be controversial is because if a politician accepts any money from anybody, a donor, a gift, a loan, they're meant to make that information public. Because if you keep it a secret, then, as we've said, you might be able to influence people or say, hey, I'm giving you this money on the sly, don't tell anybody, but by the way, can you make this your priority in government for the next few years? If he doesn't do that, then, like, as the Electoral Commission has said, there are reasonable grounds to suspect that an offence or offences may have been occurred, and it can issue a fine of up to £20,000 if that happens. So it's a fairly big deal. It would be about breaking the ministerial code of conduct, and the fact that Boris Johnson feels that he was... the fact that there's been some dodgy dealings behind the scenes, it's not a great look for him. And it's certainly something that he feels personally aggrieved that he's being attacked on this line. I don't know if you saw Prime Minister's questions the other week.
In PMQs, when he tried to defend himself against these accusations, you mean?
Yes, precisely. And Keir Starmer, obviously, the lawyer that he is, took a very precise line of questioning against him, essentially catching him on this first question, which was, how did you initially cover the costs? If you won't tell us, you can't give us a clear answer, you won't tell us here, that's why there is being a commission launched into your name. I think there's something dodgy here that you've got to hide. If you won't tell us what happened, then I'm going to be suspicious. And I think it's notable that, well, in that PMQs in particular, it was just like somebody was turning up the heat, and Johnson got angrier and angrier until his final speech to the Commons is more of a rant with some really angry pointing and shouting into the microphone. If you get a chance to, it's very easy with those things to skip to the end and just watch the 5-minute rant at the end. But if you can find the clips on YouTube, I do suggest watching the whole 15 minutes of it, because it is just it's the slow crank of pressure up and seeing Johnson get more rattled that really makes you feel that this scandal has some legs to it, particularly if Johnson is getting that kind of reaction from it. So Johnson's rattled by it. You've also got the reaction of the various Conservative Party members who have to go on TV and talk about this thing, because clearly you will get questions from people like Laura Kuenssberg who say to Matt Hancock, if a minister breaks your code of conduct, should he resign? And Matt Hancock refusing to answer that question. Basically, he said he refused to answer it because it was in a coronavirus press conference and it wasn't relevant to what they were talking about that day. But clearly, if you can't answer that question on a point of principle, that's worrying, because surely the rules are there for a reason. You shouldn't break the rules. Why should Boris Johnson be above it? The other line of defence I've seen from Conservative MPs at the moment is that the general public aren't bothered about this flat thing. They don't care about it. They just want us to concentrate on running the country. This is just a minor distraction. Forget about it. Which, again, I don't think that doesn't do hardly anything to address the concerns in question. So it's weird. It feels like, how Al Capone was brought down not because of everything else he did, but on tax evasion charges. I feel like after all the list of scandals I've listed before that, it would be really weird if this is the thing that takes Johnson down. But it's possible, and it's the most likely one at the moment because of this commission into how he acted. Now, the one big sort of counterpoint to all that, or the one thing that could scupper this thing taking Johnson down, is essentially Johnson himself will be the ultimate arbiter of if somebody breaks the ministerial code or not. To take you back to what happened with Priti Patel and bullying, when we talked about that scandal earlier on this year, an independent commission essentially ruled that Priti Patel had been a bully. Johnson looked at that, said that, no, I think this independent commission is wrong, and Priti didn't break the ministerial code and she can stay. And as a result of that, the leader of that commission basically resigned because he felt that his information wasn't being listened to in a correct way. I find it very unlikely that Johnson will find himself guilty and remove it if he is the ultimate arbiter of the ministerial code. He'll probably just say, oh, it's fine, and move on. But if he does, and if it does come to that, I think that's the main point about this whole thing, that if that commission comes out and says that Boris Johnson definitely did something wrong and broke the ministerial code, protocol dictates that that person should resign. If he doesn't resign and he just decides to move on and dismiss the findings of that independent commission, then that's a real worry for how governments can act with these sort of things in the future. Because ultimately, he might decide that if his opinion polls ratings aren't taking that much of a hit over this, he can do what he wants. But I do think that sets a dangerous precedent for previous governments. I always think in these situations, you've got to try and put yourself in the other shoes. Conservatives got to think, if Jeremy Corbyn had won the last election and he was doing those sort of things, would you be happy about that going on? Would you be happy about that leader doing those things, or would you want them removed? You've got to have that consistency in how your ministers and prime ministers act, because if they feel free, like they want to just break the rules, then who knows what they could get away with next.
Yeah. And I think just one thing to add, you said that the head of that commission, that the civil servant resigned over the Priti Patel things. That position has yet to be filled, is my understanding.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that's why Boris can say he's like, I think technically Boris already had the right to ignore, but also that no one has filled that as a civil service position since he I can't remember the name of the guy left. So yeah, it's like a double whammy where it just kind of goes straight to Boris, and the fact that he's kind of come out and said that is kind of very blatant, and it's like very telling. I feel that like he feels he can just get away with whatever. And as we've said before, many scandals that would have brought down other governments in the past. So yeah, I don't know really where that leaves us. It's kind of just
it's kind of watch this space and see how much the polls take a hit, I guess, because if he does it and the polls take a dive, then that will start to worry him, and the Conservative Party will start to worry, and then they might start to see Boris as an electoral liability rather than somebody who can win them big majorities in elections. It's kind of going back to that Donald Trump thing. Boris certainly has a base, but how low does that base go? And when he's a liability, the Conservative Party should get rid of him rather than sticking with him. I think they want to survive. But yes, I guess talking of elections and public opinion polls,
I was about to say it's probably time to have a quick look at the polls. So for people who aren't aware, there are multiple elections happening on Thursday, which is possibly I imagine this podcast will be going out on Thursday at the current rate. So you'll be able to tell us the next day how well the predictions went from the polls. But yes, there are local elections. We've already discussed that there's a London mayoral election. There are other mayoral elections, I believe. I think, do you have a mayoral election? Is that correct, out in the southwest?
We do, for the Greater Western Area election or whatever it's called. Yeah,
there's a number of local elections. So we have the Greater London Assembly to elect locally. I think there are councillors in other places all over the country. There is also up in Scotland, we've got the Scottish elections happening, and there's also the Senedd elections going on in Wales. So there's a lot of elections happening. So yeah, let's have a look at those polls. I think the first thing to discuss is, we just talked about the Conservatives coming down in the polls a bit after these scandals. Conservatives have dropped 2 percentage points since like April 14th. So as those scandals were coming out, they have been having an effect, and Labour has jumped up. Everyone else is kind of flat. So it very much shows that it's a swing between the two main parties in England. So that's interesting, but will it be enough of a difference? Because there's some polls coming out. Like I think there's that by-election that everyone's been watching. It came out, and the poll that came out was like 50% Conservative, 30-something% Labour, which does not look good for Keir Starmer, following on from our last episode. But the overall polling intention looks like a good improvement for him over the last few weeks. But will it be enough by Thursday to actually clinch those important elections?
Yeah, so I guess I'll use this as a platform for my prediction for Thursday. I think that, yeah, those scandals have hit the Conservatives, but maybe not as hard as people have thought. I think it's a weird time for those. I think, again, if politics was normal and coronavirus wasn't a thing, then they might have dipped more. But with this vaccine rollout and people wanting to get back to normal, I feel that that's what's given Johnson a boost and is what will continue to boost him, at least in the short term. If he can outlive that, that will be an interesting thing to see. That Hartlepool by-election on the surface doesn't look very good for Labour, and clearly losing that when they won it back in 2019, that would be a big blow. Like, a weird thing about that constituency in 2019, though, I think it's worth pointing out, is that you had a lot of people voting for the Brexit Party, and that kind of split the vote enough in that Hartlepool constituency to get Labour over the finish line there. But if all the people who voted for the Brexit Party now voted for Conservatives, then the Conservatives should win that seat, if you get what I mean. So if that's the result, that might show a really interesting long-term shift from those red wall seats to Conservatives. But equally, when we look at the London mayoral election, which Sadiq Khan is predicted to win like at a canter, we don't talk much about the Conservatives' problems in London. And how they used to be big contenders in there, and now it seems very much like a Labour stronghold throughout, particularly if the Khan election is, if Khan gets re-elected with a handsome majority. And we've talked in the past about how weak the Sean Bailey candidacy is, particularly for London Mayor. So we are seeing different splits emerge in politics. The split between sort of like the cities of of London and Manchester, all those like old Labour hotspots, I think they're only getting more Labour, but the countryside and those ones up in the north are getting more Conservative. And are we seeing like a more long-term withdrawal of how politics works in this country? That would be very interesting to see. I don't think people would expect, I think, and you'll see those on the left criticise Keir Starmer after the results of these councils, because I don't think he's going to make big ingrained, don't think he's going to make big jumps into Conservative leads anywhere. But they did come off quite the election loss in 2019 and haven't really had that many opportunities to rebuild after that in what has been, as we've mentioned for the past year, an odd time in British politics. So yeah, we'll wait and see, and I'll be really interested to talk about those results with you. But I think that it'll be a fairly good night for the Conservatives, or they'll certainly be able to spin it as a good night for the Conservatives, and maybe a less good one for the Labour Party.
It's definitely interesting watching. You often see these big gaps in the polls, and then as an election comes up, things narrow. And I think, well, we've only got a few more minutes now. I'm just going to quickly whip through the other elections. So Scotland, the SNP had a very clear lead earlier on, and it's just come down a bit. And Conservatives and Labour has jumped up nearer the Conservatives. So I think everyone's pretty clear that the SNP will still win that election. But the question is whether there will be a majority for a second referendum, i.e. in a big enough majority of just the SNP. And I think people are now starting to question whether they'll have enough votes for that. Obviously, the SNP will claim that they have a mandate for a second referendum, whatever, but it'll be easier for them to claim that if they have a full majority. So I think it's interesting to see, again, as election day closes on us, Conservatives and Labour jumping up there, and the SNP coming down. So those are the anti-independence parties versus the independence parties, essentially. And a little bit of an uptick in Lib Dems, but probably not enough to matter overall, like 1% increase. And then the other thing to look at, as we said, and similarly, as election day closes, No has overtaken for second independence referendum, which it's always interesting to see how the polls close when the reality of voting gets closer. And then the other thing is the Welsh Assembly. So looking at that, basically the current polling suggests with UKIP gone and the Brexit Party not going to win anything, the percentages are kind of readjusting, and that a lot of that is going towards the Conservatives, which is not surprising. If UKIP goes from 12% of the vote to 0%, that's going to go to the Conservatives. And then it looks like Labour is still going to be in charge, but Labour, Conservative and Plaid Cymru are going to get more seats, is the current prediction, which I think would put a hung parliament in Wales because Labour needs 31 seats for a majority, and it's suggesting they're going to end up with a net -1, actually. Despite the change in percentage, it's mostly going to go to the Conservatives. But we'll have to keep an eye on it. One last thing to mention as we're talking about polls. Interesting polls abound at the moment because we have polls for voting that's happening this week. Then if you look over in Germany, we have polls about what might happen with the German election, because we know that Angela Merkel is going to step down, and the CDU, which is there's currently a coalition with the CDU as the main partner, and they've handled certain parts of the pandemic a bit poorly, especially this year. And it's interesting to see polling coming out with the Green Party in the lead over in Germany. And obviously their Green Party has always been more powerful than ours because they have a proportional representation voting system over there. Parties like the Green Party have been able to slowly gain traction and get bigger. But it's interesting to see that the Green Party could potentially win the majority of votes, even if it doesn't have the big enough majority to form a government in Germany. So eyes on that election when that happens as well.
But still, that would be like a big end in German history, wouldn't it? If the CDU gets power shifted away from them, and particularly the end of Merkel, it will certainly be the end of an era. So yeah, worth keeping an eye on.
Anna, that was our kind of brief, slightly briefer than normal episode, as I have to shoot off. But thank you for joining me as always, Rob.
That's all right, no problem.
Hopefully, as I say, I'll get this out in time for the best poll, which is an actual election. So. Yeah, thank you as always for joining me, Rob. You can find us in all the usual places online. Go to parliamentary.observer, where you can find the podcast and the show notes. You can find us on Facebook as Unparliamentary Language. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at UnParlPodcast, and you can find us on Reddit at /r/unparliamentary. And if you want to join our other patrons to support us and pay off the cost of the website for the month, that'd be great. Go to patreon.com/TTSS. And there's nothing left for me to say other than it's good night from me.
And it's good night from him.
Bye. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.
Hi, have you ever wondered what would happen if you took the schoolyard conversation of which one of my favourite fictional characters would win in a fight? Well, wonder no more. Join me, Chris, and my co-host Matt every other Sunday for Mish Mash Mayhem, and you can find out.